Genesis 1, verse 31. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Genesis 2, verse 15. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And finally, Romans 8, verses 18 to 25. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently.
Good morning. As you've heard, so today is our Eco Church Sunday. So my name's Paul. I think most of you know me. And we're going to look this morning a bit about what the Bible says and what God says about caring for our creation. So there's three things we want to look at. Firstly, a bit of a look at what the Bible says about caring for creation. Secondly, a bit about how well are we doing at caring for creation. And then finally, a little bit about what more can we do and what can we do about that. So three areas to look at. But first, I'd like you all to just close your eyes. Now, this is risky because I'm going to ask you to open your eyes again in a minute, so go with me. So I'm sure you've all had this experience where you've been on a walk in the countryside or maybe camping or a walk by the river or maybe on holiday and up the mountains, and you've looked across and you've seen the scenery and thought, this is just beautiful. This is really moving and it moves your heart. So I'd love you to think of somewhere where you had that experience. So for me, it was recently. At the end of last year, I went with my mother and my brother to walk along part of the South Downs Way in Sussex. And you can imagine me up there, the sun was shining, the wind was blowing, looking out across the fields and the woods and the hills and seeing the sea in the distance sparkling, just beautiful. And your heart moves and you think, that is just amazing. And that is something of God's creation speaking to us. Okay, you can open your eyes now. If anybody's not opening their eyes, neighbors, please prod them. And we saw in that first verse, at the end of that amazing first chapter of Genesis, where you hear about God's incredible creation of the world, that last verse, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And God saw his creation and saw it was good. And so when we see that beauty of that creation and our hearts really stir, we're responding to that beauty that God has created. And it really touches us. And we read in the Bible, in the Psalms, in the book of Job, again and again, God's people being moved by the wonder of his creation. So God saw all that he had created, and it was good. And he also gave us the job of looking after it. So the second reading that Julia had to run to said that God put the man in the garden to work it and to take care of it, so to take care of his creation. So it's often said that the very first command that God gave to us was to take care of his creation. Now there's a slide that's about to come up. Here we go. I don't know if you can see that. So this is a picture of God's original creation and us with him and with creation as part of the beginning of time. And we see there's us and we're in relationship with God, we're in relationship with each other, we're in relationship with creation. And we see that when we see that story of the Garden of Eden, of God's creation, that picture, that vision of us in perfect relationship with all of those things. But we know it didn't stay that way, right? We messed up, we've rebelled, we've turned against God. And so that relationship with God has become broken. That relationship with each other has become broken. And so we switch on our TVs today and we see war and fighting and injustice and suffering because our relationship with each other has become broken. And our relationship with creation has become broken through our own rebellion. We see pollution, we see deforestation, we see climate change, the relationship with creation broken. And what Jesus did when he came was to begin the process of, through his death and resurrection, healing those broken relationships and returning us to that place that God always wanted us to be. And not just that relationship with him, not just that upward relationship. Do you mind sticking it back up again? Sorry, the first slide. Not just that relationship between us and God, that we share our faith and we grow in our faith and we come to know him better, but also as part of our mission is restoring those relationships. And Jesus came to restore those relationships with each other as well. So human rights, injustice, poverty, all those things, but also caring for creation, restoring that relationship there and bringing us back into creation. And we saw in that reading in Romans how the creation itself is subject to bondage and is crying out, and that Jesus is also restoring the whole of creation to the way he wants it to be, to that beautiful place. So that's our picture. So part of our mission, following in Jesus' footsteps, is to both restore those upward relationships, to tell people about Jesus, to bring them into relationship with God, to grow in our faith, is to restore those relationships to each other. So as a church and as Christians, we speak into injustice in the world and poverty and human rights abuses and things like that. But also as Christians, part of our mission is caring for God's creation, restoring creation as well. So how are we doing on that mission? How are we doing on that mission of caring for God's creation? I would suggest to you we're maybe not doing that well. So maybe the next slide. So this is a graph that shows the amount of fossil fuels that have been emitted in the last 150 years. And you can see it just going up and up and up and up and up. So the amount of fossil fuels is now 5,000 more than it was 200 years ago, 5,000% greater. So we see climate change as a result of these greenhouse gas emissions. And to give you a couple of stats on climate change. So in the UK, we started measuring the amount of rainflow each year as far back as 1772. So every year since 1772, the amount of rainfall has been measured. And of the 5 ever wettest years, 4 of those have all been since the year 2000. So right the way through, the last few years have been the most rainfall, the most flooding, all linked to climate change. And in the UK, we've measured the temperature every year all the way back to 1885. So the temperature for every year back to 1885. And in all of that time, well over 100 years, the hottest 10 years have been the last 10 years. So last 10 years, every single year has been a record temperature. Last year was the hottest year ever recorded. So we see this climate change having a huge impact. And that really matters because, as scientists tell us, this is the latest list of impacts of climate change. Heat waves, droughts, floods, cyclones, wildfires, landslides, polar ice cap melting, melting glaciers, sea level rise, devastation of coral systems, mass food and freshwater shortages, ill health, huge negative economic impacts, conflicts over scarce resources, and the creation of huge numbers of climate refugees. So all of these things hit the very poorest people hardest in our world. And that's just climate change. There's other things as well. So let's think about God's beautiful creation we talked about, all of the animals and the plants and so on. Now for this, I need a little bit of audience participation. So if you're able to, would you mind standing up, please? Right. So now you represent way back 1970, 55 years ago. This is the amount of wildlife there was in the world. So that's every species of animal, every plant, and the numbers of each of those species. So these have been recorded again by scientists all the way back from 1955. And what they did was look at what it was in 1970, 55 years ago, 1970. They looked at what it was in 1970, and then they've recorded it every year since to see the size of those populations of wildlife since then. So now, if you are on the front 5 rows on this side, can you stay standing, please? So just work out where you are. And the rest of you can sit down. This is what is left today. Just since 1970, 73% of all populations, of all animals, of all plants, everywhere, have gone. So just in the last 55 years. So that's a massive, massive change. Thank you, guys. You can sit down as well. So that's loss of animals and wildlife. But there's other things. There's pollution, there's waste. In the UK, we throw away enough plastic to fill 2 double-decker buses every 30 seconds. So there's pollution, there's waste, there's deforestation. And all of this is really real for real people. So if we could have the next slide up, please. This, I don't know if you can see that very clearly. This is a village in Bangladesh I visited a few years ago for work. And Bangladesh, famously, as a result of climate change, the sea is getting higher and higher. It's a very low-lying country. It's slowly going underwater. So I visited this community who are right on the sea edge. And I sat in one of these homes with a lady called Noura. And she was telling me about her life and the life of her family. And she pointed way out to sea and said, our first home was way, way, way out there. And since then, we've had 6 homes as the sea's grown. We've had to move back and back and back. And we were then sat in her 6th home. And where they were, you could see the waters are high already. And there wasn't much further they could go back. Behind them was a big commercial shrimp farm. There was nowhere further to go. And the sea level were rising and rising. And it sticks on my mind, because while we were sat in her house talking about this, the water was up around our knees while we were talking about it. And she was an amazing, empowered woman. And she sort of said to me, actually, we don't need your help, really, from Western countries, but what we just need is solid ground beneath our feet. If you just give us solid ground beneath our feet, we'll solve the rest of our problems ourselves. A really empowered woman, but devastated by the changes to the climate. And then the next slide. So a couple of years ago, I had the chance to go to Indonesia, and I was on one of the islands there, and I went swimming in the ocean, and I was swimming through plastic bags and plastic bottles and old toothbrushes and flip-flops and just miles of plastic. And every morning, the beaches were just absolutely inundated with plastic as a result of plastic out in the oceans coming up onto the shore. And I worked with a local group to do beach cleaning. I spent 2 hours, and I was given a 2-meter square portion of beach to clean. And at the end of 2 hours, I had about cleaned all the bits of plastic, these tiny little bits of plastic off this beach. And the wave came in, went over my 2-meter square, came back, and there was more plastic there than when I'd started. So, I mean, just horrific to see how we've messed up that beauty of God's creation. And then the last slide, it comes closer to home as well. So this is just down the road, right? The Thames, and we've seen more and more and more flooding in the UK in the years have gone by as a result of climate change too. So we're not doing that well of caring for creation. So what can we do, and what should we do? So first of all, I think we have to start with hope. So we know that God is coming, that through Jesus' death and resurrection, that Jesus is coming again, and he will restore all of his broken creation, restore it. So the victory is already won. So we are people of hope, and we know that, and we have that hope to cling to. But not just that hope in the future, but hope in the here and now as well, that things can change. So many of you may remember, or some of you, not all of you, some of you may remember in the 1980s, we used to talk a lot about the hole in the ozone layer. Do people remember that? So there used to be this big problem of CFC gases going up into the atmosphere, creating a hole in the ozone layer, and solar radiation coming through and causing all kinds of problems. And then in 1987, the world agreed the Montreal Protocol that banned those gases. And that hole is now largely repaired. So that was a huge environmental crisis that's been fixed. 100 years ago, the rivers and the trees and so on in this country would have been way more polluted than they are now as a result of the Industrial Revolution. But so much legislation has protected and cleaned up those rivers and the air we breathe in our big cities and so on. So things can really change, so we should have hope. So what can we do? Last slide, 5 things I would suggest we can do. Firstly, we can pray. We must always start with prayer, right? As Christians, that's our first thing we do, is turn to God in prayer and pray for his creation. Secondly, we can give. So we've heard about Eco Church this morning. That's linked to a Christian group called Arosha that does amazing work restoring God's creation. So we can give to groups like that. Thirdly, we can take practical action. We've heard about Eco Church here, so that's something we can do together as a church and all the kind of things we've been talking about. Fourthly, we can look at what we consume. So where do we get our electricity from? Is it a renewable energy source? Where do we use different, how much do we fly? How much do we use public transport? Things we can do to reduce the impact that we're having in our own lives. And finally, close to my heart, we can speak out to those in authority and challenge them and be like the prophets of the Old Testament and hold justice and truth to them and demand more action from them. So 5 things we can do. And as you heard earlier, the Arise group in this church is one great way that you can do that and get involved with that. So speak to me or the staff team if you'd be interested in doing that. Thank you all. So hopefully that gives you a little bit about God's call to us to care for his creation, a little bit about how we're doing, and a little bit about what we can do, and that we can have hope as we do all of that. Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Sophie and the band to come back up.